Great. So we'll get started with the affordable housing development and supportive housing set in the series. And I think, Teresa, you want to give an announcement about some changes for tonight.
Yes, thanks to everyone who's joining us tonight for the Affordable Housing Education Series. Today, we were going to focus on just the introductory affordable housing development, and we were hoping to also talk about supportive housing. However, our speaker, Arbor Patino, has COVID and is home, not feeling great. So we're going to have her join us in June and catch up a little bit, just expand our series a little bit in June to make sure we cover that very important topic. But tonight we're going to just zoom in and focus on sort of the basics around affordable housing development, and Jennifer Hall from the Ann Arbor Housing Commission is going to kick it off for us.
Great, thank you for having me again. I'm actually going to try to do a little bit more interactive, which means the panelists can interact. I don't think the people who are watching are able to interact, but I have some points in time where I'll be asking some questions. So I'm hoping people will be comfortable responding and thinking about some of the questions that are brought up. My presentation tonight is really development. I call it Development 101. I don't go into great depth on development, but I do have some basic development guidelines or principles or things that would be very helpful for this board to understand in thinking about affordable housing development going forward. And this is a slide probably everybody's seen and heard and understands, but I want to really focus on this issue of what is affordable housing and how does this impact how we move forward with different kinds of development. So the general consensus as a description and a guideline, especially from HUD, is if you're paying at more than 30% of your gross annual income on housing, then it's considered to be a cost burden. So the goal is to pay 30% of your housing costs or 30% of your household gross income on your housing cost or less. A newer definition that is often discussed is thinking about, especially in a place like Ann Arbor and Washtenaw County, where you have very high housing costs. And so people, excuse me, end up moving farther and farther away from where their jobs are, for example, and they have commuting times where their housing costs may be less, but then you have their transportation costs. So if you add the two together, then if it's more than 45% of your income, then it's a cost burden. So keeping that in mind, the new area median incomes just came out from HUD recently, and Ann Arbor had the largest increase ever from 106,600 in 2021 to 117,800 in 2022. Prior to that, you know, it could range from 1,000 to, I think the most before that maybe was like a $4,000 or $5,000 jump. So having $11,000 increase is quite a reflection of what's happening in our community. And don't forget, when I say Ann Arbor area median income, it actually includes all of Washtenaw County. We're the primary metropolitan statistical area. So I'm going to show 3 charts, and I really need people to sort of understand how these charts work. So when HUD comes out with the median family income, they basically put that number into the median income for a 4-person household. So you can see in this chart, the 117,800, that's where HUD places the median income. And then every other number in this chart is a formula. Every number is a formula. That's what you got to remember. So it's not like HUD did a market study on 1-person, 2-person, 3-person households and then tried to figure out where you all fit. This is just a formula based off of 117,800. And so then if you take these numbers, and you can see I have highlighted a little bit darker the 60% of area median income, because that is the sort of target of where the city's affordable housing policies have landed, whether it's through brownfield funding or the millage or affordable housing fund. It's that 60% AMI. Different programs have different income limits and different AMIs that you're targeting. but that's why that happens to be highlighted there. So if you take these numbers and you say, okay, if this is my income, what is 30% of my income? What would my housing cost be? So the next chart is showing that number. So if you look at in the red, 4-person household, 100% median income, that's $2,945. And if you look at the 60% AMI, 1, 2, 3, 4-person household, you can see that those numbers might feel very large to you. And you might think, really, that's the target of housing costs that we're looking at here. And it's absolutely a reflection of the continued increase in median income that gets reflected back into every other category, so that 50% of medians higher, 30% of medians higher, et cetera. I'm actually going to stop here and see if there's any questions. This is going to be a slow move tonight. Looks like Lynn has a question.
There was an increase from last year, correct?
Correct. It went from 106,600 to 117,800. Yeah, a huge increase.
And it's continued to increase each year before that too. Like, it's not just that one year that there was a large increase.
It just happens to be the largest
Yeah.
increase we've seen, but yeah, it's always been increasing, at least the 30 years I've been doing this. Okay, now I have circled in yellow, 60% AMI, a 3-person household, 1,591. And I'm going to relate that to the next chart. So when MSHDA is a housing program, or MSHDA has a lot of housing programs, but they administer the largest housing program for affordable housing, which is the low-income housing tax credits. And so what MSHDA does every year is they publish the maximum rent per bedroom, not per, well, they also publish for AMI, but really when you're a developer, you're looking at how much can I charge for a 2-bedroom if my target income is 60% AMI. The maximum I can charge for a 2-bedroom is, $1,591. I can charge less than that, but I cannot charge more than that. And that has to include utilities. And so this is what a 60% AMI tax credit maximum rent would look like in Washtenaw County, in Ann Arbor. So here's one of my questions. Oh, I think I have it on my next page, sorry. I think one of the things, before I get to the next page, that people need to understand is that these are just rents that are supposed to be less than market rate. These aren't rent subsidies where somebody pays 30% of their income on rent. So if you look at the next chart, I've got the 2 charts there together. So the first one on the top is a 2-bedroom tax credit rent at 60% AMI is $1,591. So if you look at the chart below that, and you see the household size and you see the AMIs and the rents, based on the 2 charts and based on the one on the bottom right, which household size and what AMI levels are eligible to move into that 2-bedroom unit above that costing $1,591. You can throw out a whole group, you can throw out 1 or 2 or whatever you think.
A 3-person at 60% AMI.
That's one of them. Anybody else that would be eligible to move into there? Oh, you're on mute, Amanda.
The 2-person at 60% AMI.
Yep. Anybody else?
Anyone at 50%?
Anyone at 50% up
Or 30%?
or 30%. And really it's anyone in 1, 2, 3, or 4-person household up to 60% AMI. And you might think, oh, it's a 2-bedroom. Why would a 1-person household live there? you can ask for a reasonable accommodation. We've had that happen once in a while where somebody has a lot of medical equipment. It's not, very often, but where they need a second bedroom for whatever reason for medical care. And for a 3 or 4 person household, all different programs have different occupancy standards of how big a household is that lives in that apartment when it's an affordable housing program or some kind of subsidized program. So if you're market rate housing, nobody's going to tell you you're a 1 person, you can't buy a 3-bedroom house. You can buy whatever you want. You could buy a 10-bedroom house. You can buy a 500 square foot building or apartment or house or a 25,000 square foot. But when you're in subsidized housing, there are these occupancy standards, and typically, but not always, it is 2 heartbeats per bedroom. So you could have up to 4 people in a 2-bedroom household. And there's usually some kind of local building code that might affect that as well. And then you might have some different rules about age and gender. Sharing rooms are not required to share rooms, and you may end up with a bigger apartment attached to your household because you have a 7-year-old girl and a 15-year-old boy and a mom. So you may end up in a 3-bedroom, even though you have 3 people. Is there any questions about that? Because I have some more questions to ask you.
Jennifer, the 4-person household at 60% AMI is highlighted as meeting that. Is that correct?
That's correct, because you can be a 4-person household and live in a 60% AMI unit that's 2 bedrooms, as long as you meet the 60% income level for your household. So this is part of my next question. If you look at all those eligible households, how much are each of them paying? Like, pick one of those households and tell me how much they're going to be paying for that 2-bedroom I have circled above. How much is a 3-person household at 60% AMI paying? $1,591. How much is a 2-person household at 50% AMI paying? I know what you're saying, Amanda. I can see your lips move.
$1,178.
$1,591.
Oh, right. Yes. Duh.
How much is a 1-person household at 30% AMI paying? $1,591. And this is the thing that I really need people to understand, is when you have a subsidy on the development side, what you're doing in our, programs are different, but let's just take the tax credit program because that's the biggest. You are basically having, you are required to have rents that don't exceed, the published amounts you see here. And you can charge less than that, but theoretically, these are below the market. So you have below market rents. But you are not guaranteeing that somebody's going to pay 30% of their income if they move in there. Can anybody tell me, how do you guarantee that somebody pays 30% of their income if they move into one of these apartments? I guess there's 2 ways.
You have a subsidy attached to the unit.
So you have actual rental subsidy, like a voucher, like a project-based voucher attached to the unit. Correct. So if it's a project-based voucher, which right now 100%, actually that's not true, Lurie Terrace isn't that way. Most of our apartments have a project-based voucher. So no matter who moves in, no matter what the rent is, their portion is 30% of their gross income, and then HUD pays the rest. You could also have a tenant-based voucher. So I could have this project without any subsidy attached to the unit, but you bring a voucher that is attached to your household into the unit, and you pay 30% of your income on the rent as well. And then there's a third way. You may have exactly the right income as a 3-person household at 60% AMI, where $1,591 is exactly 30% of your household income. But if it's not, you will be paying that full rent. So you could be living here and paying well over 30% of your income, even though you were in a subsidized below market rate rent unit. Does that make sense? So when developers do tax credit projects, you do have to figure out what your income targets are in advance, and you can't exceed those income targets as you are renting up over time. You can charge less than the maximum. So if I'm looking at these rents and I'm like, wow, I really don't want to charge $1,326 like that, even though that is the max, I can say it's a 60% AMI unit and I can charge $1,000 or I can charge $900. And that way you do end up with more people who, when they move in, it's not, excessively high for their income. And generally speaking, when we have units targeted at 30% AMI or less, we want to have a project-based voucher on that unit, because otherwise it's an impossible mix to have somebody with that low of an income paying those higher rent rates. All right, before I move on, is there any other questions about this? Okay, this is just a fundamental thing you need to understand moving forward. So how are those rents determined, and how do we determine appropriate rents for, let's say, a tenant-based voucher? So if somebody has a tenant-based voucher and we are administering the vouchers and they are out in the marketplace looking for a place to live with a private landlord, there's a thing called fair market rent, which you may have also heard of, that's used in the home program. So basically HUD does do a market analysis. I don't know how they do it, but supposedly they look at all the housing in your marketplace, and they don't do they do an analysis. They don't use something that's been built in the last 2 years, and they try to avoid non-luxury type housing. And then they publish all across the United States what they call the fair market rent for your primary statistical area, which again is Ann Arbor and Washtenaw County. And so this is the 2022 fair market rents on that first line, $1,048 for 1 bedroom, $1,262 for a 2 bedroom. Now, of course, if you're in downtown Ann Arbor versus out in northern Milan area, the rents are totally different from each other. This covers the whole market area. And so when we are determining what our rental voucher amounts can be, HUD says your what they call payment standard. So the payment standard has to be between 90% and 110% of the fair market rent. And it gets republished every year. Every year it changes. And once in a while it goes down in Washtenaw County, but almost always it goes up. It's very rare for it to go down. I think, and it may go down for a 1 bedroom and up for a 3 bedroom. Like, you never know. So every year they republish it. So in the last, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years, we've always made our payment standard be 110% of the fair market rent, which is the maximum that's allowed, because we find that it's so hard for people to find housing within that price range in the marketplace, not just in Ann Arbor, but throughout the county. It's really challenging. This year, we adopted 120% of FMR is our current standard, because HUD allowed for 1 year due to COVID to increase it up to 120%. So until December 31st of 22, currently our payment standard is 120% of the FMR throughout Washtenaw County. But how does that work? The payment standard is not the rent. And this is very confusing. It's very confusing for tenants. And in fact, if you guys ever want to have a in-depth discussion about the voucher program, Wanisha Brand is your woman to come back here and give you a training, and I can give you the high level and answer some questions, but she can go in depth on it. She's the expert. So what the payment standard is that's the maximum subsidy, the maximum HUD subsidy that we will pay for your rent, and we add it to your portion, 30% of your income. So if our, I'm just gonna make up the number 1,000. Let's say our payment standard for a 1-bedroom was $1,000, just to make it even. And your portion of the rent was $300. And that includes utilities. So the maximum rent and utilities of an apartment that you can afford to live in with a voucher is $1,300. If your portion of the rent was $500, then you could shop for a $1,500 apartment. So it's not, when you see the payment standard, it's not the rent that's allowed out there. It's basically the maximum we can use to subsidize the apartment that you're living in. And that is the simple version. And if you ever talk to Anisha, she'll give you a but in this case, but in this case, but in this case. But that's the simplified version of it. The other thing that people need to understand is we have to do what's called a rent reasonableness analysis for our tenant-based vouchers and for our project-based, actually. So what that means is, because these numbers are across the county, but every market is different, you know, if you're in Dexter or Ipsy or wherever you're at, they're all different. We actually have to compare the rent for where you want to move to the rents of a similar apartment in that neighborhood. And if it's too high, we can't approve it. So you can't have a landlord that's like, well, it's a voucher, I'm going to charge $1,500, but all my other apartments are $1,000. Nope, sorry, all your other apartments are $1,000. The most you can charge for this person is $1,000 as well. That's essentially what that means. All right, I'm going to stop because that was a lot to digest. Does anybody have any questions about that or any comments? Okay. This is just a free-for-all. How are low-income residents impacted by the city of Ann Arbor's housing market? Anyone? Anna?
Sure. They are unable to find housing in Ann Arbor, and so they're forced to look for housing sometimes much further out.
Sometimes not even in Washtenaw County. So, and this even impacts people with a voucher. So even though we're the Ann Arbor Housing Commission, when folks get a voucher from us, even if they really, really want to live in Ann Arbor and they look and look and look and look, it doesn't mean they're able to find a place that within that payment standard voucher amount that they can afford with their voucher. And so, excuse me, and the city of Ann Arbor now does not allow a landlord to discriminate based on their source of income, including having a voucher. And a voucher is, although it's technically not a source of income, in the city's ordinance, if you have a voucher, it is counted as 3 times the voucher value. So if the voucher value is $500, then it's counted as $1,500 worth of income. That way, if a landlord says, look, you can't move in here unless your income is 3 times the amount of the rent, then you can add that 3 times the voucher and add it to their rent. And so there's all kinds of ways that landlords can still prevent people with vouchers to move into their housing. There's all kinds of fair housing reasons that have nothing to do with the voucher. But there's also things like having a minimum credit score requirement and things like that, maybe our tenants cannot quite meet that. So people still end up literally because there's not rents that are low enough, but also because the screening criteria is really high. And so they have a hard time finding a place in Ann Arbor. So most of our vouchers are actually not even utilized in Ann Arbor, even with a voucher.
And just to add on to that, I think the other thing that's at play in addition to the cost is the size of the units in Ann Arbor. I think the average size is like around 878 or something like that. It's under 900 square feet. So if you have a larger family, there's less stock for that. And in addition to the cost, then you get size limitations sometimes too. We won't be able to find anything that works for your family.
Yeah, and to that point, A lot of times when we have families, as opposed to like 1 and 2 bedrooms are much easier. 3, 4, 5, especially 5 or anything larger than that is almost impossible. But just like anyone else who doesn't have a voucher, if you have a family, people prefer to be, if they can, they want to find a single family home. So finding a single family home within those voucher amounts is extraordinarily challenging compared to like a 2-bedroom in an apartment complex. And so that totally yeah, agree with what Teresa's saying. And there's not a lot of 3 or 4 bedroom apartments even. That's like very, very rare. So when we look at, there's different programs that look at poverty. And when you look at poverty, it's not always an indication of where low income people live. So if you look at this map, which I have a feeling you might have to move your heads like I do if you want to see. This is a map of Washtenaw County. So when you look at this map, what do you think about where the purple areas are for the city of Ann Arbor? Like, what is that telling you?
Students.
Students. Students, 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 students. Students, when the Census Bureau comes by and says, how much is your income? And they're like, oh, I make, $4,000 on my summer job. You're in poverty on paper, according to the census. And so even though we have these purple census tracts, which are the ones that are showing here, it's called a qualified census tract, which means that half of the households have incomes below 60% of the area median income, or the poverty rate is 25% or more. And so these are not areas that we generally associate with low income areas of the city of Ann Arbor. And even when you look out in Ypsi, you can see around EMU and Washtenaw Community College, the same thing. And so if it's not around the universities or the colleges, those really are the areas with the highest poverty rates in the county, and it's not Ann Arbor. In fact, if you look at poverty as a census definition by age in Ann Arbor, this is actual Ann Arbor, not Washtenaw County. You can see it's very much dominated by 18 to 24-year-olds. So just another way of representing, how many poor people actually live in the city. So if there's such a huge demand for affordable housing, why isn't the private sector developing it? Because my goodness, so many people need this housing. So on the one side, no matter what, it's going to require subsidy. And I'm going to talk about that, and you'll understand that part when I get into it. There's limited amounts of subsidy out there. It's competitive. And just development in general is very high risk. It's market driven. It's site specific. So developing something in downtown Ann Arbor versus even, in Southeast Ann Arbor, where I live, is very different than Dexter Township or somewhere else. It depends on the place, what the costs are and what you can build there. And I'm going to go into like the things you look at when you're looking at doing a development, what impacts the development. Okay, this I'm gonna need at least 3 to 4 people to give me one thing that is a cost to develop a residential project. What is something, if it's a brand new construction, what are some of the things that it costs to do that? Anybody?
Land.
Land.
Permits.
Permits. That's 2.
Materials, labor.
Labor, materials. Excellent. Let's start with that. So do I get a discount because I'm an affordable housing developer? No. Does the city give me a permit discount because I'm an affordable housing developer? No, just in zoning, it's about 10 grand discount. Does an architect give me a discount because I'm doing affordable housing? No. So the cost of doing construction, and I say market rate and affordable, but really it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's home ownership, co-op, rental, market rate, all those things. We all have to pay for land. We all got to pay permits. We all got to hire people. Like, it's essentially the same. There's some small differences. So If I'm a high-end, market rate developer, I might have more expensive materials that I'm using for my finishes, for example. But that's a marginal, tiny little cost compared to land, as an example. So from the cost side, what does it cost to develop? It's essentially the same, regardless of the type of housing that you're doing. The biggest difference really is how do you finance what you're building? Where does your money come from? Does it cost you anything, or is it like a grant where you don't have to repay it back? So on the market, and this is like simplest discussion. When the next couple sessions where we talk about financing, you can have a much more sophisticated person speaking about how you finance things. I'm giving you the simple 101 version. So on the market rate side, typically like if any of you own your own home, and you put 20% down, that's your equity in your home, and then you take a mortgage out for 80%. That's pretty typical. And there's other ways to layer the financing. So you basically have, cash type money in the blue, and then the rest is loans, which means you have to pay them back, which means they have interest, which means it affects what your costs are on your operating side. When you do a tax credit deal, let's say you did a tax credit deal and you're just going to make every unit 60% AMI. You're not going to try to target 30% or supportive housing. It's just all 60% AMI. Typically, it's a bit flipped. So you might have, when you sell your tax credits to an investor, it typically covers about 60 to 70% of your development costs. And then the rest of it, typically, you take out as a loan. So you have a lot less money you have to pay back. You have a lot more money that's grant-like, cash-like equity. And so that also affects your operations. And then when you have a tax credit deal, typically a nonprofit like us or Avalon or any other nonprofits, they really are targeting lower incomes and a mixture of incomes more typically. And so they might get the same amount of equity, but they can't afford as big of a loan because they have lower rents. And if your rents aren't high enough to pay back your loan, then you need to have grant money. And so the gray is grant money, the orange is a loan, and the blue is equity. Is there any questions about that? Okay. Same question. I need 3 to 4 people or actual answers on what are the various types of operating costs for residential development. What do you have to pay for when you're operating something that's a resident? I don't care if it's a co-op. I don't care if it's your house. I don't care if it's a rental. They all got operating costs.
Water and sewer.
Water and sewer. Utility. Maintenance. Taxes. One more.
Electricity.
All right, we'll go with that. So
Is there insurance too?
Insurance. So on the maintenance, like let's say if you're a homeowner, some of you might be very handy and you just have to pay for materials. But what if you're not? You got to pay someone to do the work, whether you're a renter, you have maintenance staff. Somebody's got to maintain the building. If you took out a loan, you got to pay debt. So the bigger your loan is, the more debt you got to pay off, the higher your rent has to be because you got to be able to pay all your costs. So this is just a simplified version to illustrate the difference between what the rents need to be to cover your costs when you have a market rate unit. You can see, and I actually show that the operations for market rate are a little bit less than the tax credit units. We do tend to have more expense because we have tons and tons of regulations that we have to comply with. And so we end up having a higher staff ratio to both maintain the buildings, to do income and rent certifications. And I have it even a little bit higher. The lower the income is that we target, we tend to have, frankly, just more damages to units, higher wear and tear. People live there actually longer. So when you have a unit turn, Can be very expensive, but you also have people living there longer, so you have fewer unit turns. But it's generally the blue is just like that day-to-day operations cost. And the orange is the debt. So you can see a large amount of market rate revenue coming in. This says rent, but really pays your debt. And so you have to remember that when you're thinking about, the greedy developers out there, they actually have some costs higher than what we have because they have so much more debt. Then I had a little bit of capital reserves to pay for future development. Taxes. We in Ann Arbor have a payment in lieu of taxes of $1 per unit per year for eligible projects. Tax credit projects are eligible, 60% AMI units or less. So you can see that if you're a market rate unit, you also have to pay taxes. And then I put ROI, return on your investment, on the market rate side, that equity cash, that 20% or 10%, whatever they end up putting in at the front end is usually, but not always, somebody is investing in that project. They expect a return on their investment. So it's kind of like taking on debt, but it's not a guaranteed payment. It's a payment if you have the cash flow to pay it, kind of a thing. I'm simplifying this. And then any kind of debt anyone takes out, the lender will expect you to have a certain debt coverage ratio. And so you'll do your projections on what you think your operating costs are. And let's say it's, $5,000 a year. They'll have typically for us on the type of housing we do, we have to have a 1.15 debt coverage service ratio. So whatever the math is for that, we have to have at least a 15% cushion on our operating revenue versus if you deduct our expenses to make sure we can pay our debt and have a little bit of cushion there. So that's what that teeny little bit of blue is. That's also on the dark blue on the top. That's on the tax credit units. Anybody have any questions about any of this? Okay. Now I'm going to go into sort of site specific. What is it you look at when you're looking at a site? How do you know what it is you can build there? And then after that, I'm going to talk about actual sites and things that actually happen on those sites that are impacting, what we're trying to develop there. So the first thing you really need to look at is land use restrictions. In most communities, at least cities and some townships, and I don't know, Teresa can tell me how many rural areas have zoning and use restrictions. So typically, no matter where you go, there's going to be some municipality that says you can only build X number of units per acre or X number of units per whatever this zoning is, or you can only do residential, or you can do residential and commercial, or whatever the case may be. So you have to figure out if the place you want to build is zoned to what you want to build there. And then if you're in Ann Arbor and a lot of other places, but Ann Arbor has a lot of additional requirements like how much open space also needs to be included, how much parking. So that can impact the density, the location, the setbacks of where your properties are when you add other layers of requirements. And then the other thing is you want to look and see if there's any restrictions that are on those properties that you want to do a nice title search, find out, is there any kind of restriction on your property that would preclude you from building there? And so these are just a couple examples that happened with the city where they had a FEMA grant that prohibited development, MDEQ, and then Parks property has to have a ballot approval to do any kind of change from a Parks property. So there's different things you have to look at. The other thing is particularly, this applies to any kind of housing, but particularly if you're doing affordable housing and you have some kind of federal program in particular, and even the state of Michigan has a tax under the tax credit financing. They don't have the same regulations as the federal government, but they have adopted voluntarily some regulations related to environmental conditions. And this is all intended to be good and has been good and has weird things that happen because of it in Ann Arbor. So the there's a history of citing affordable housing in the unhealthiest, most contaminated, worst locations. And so this is designed to try to help make sure that that doesn't happen. But this doesn't only apply to housing. It also applies, like if you were to build literally a road or a railroad and you have federal funds, you have to do an environmental review. It's called NEPA. Teresa will be happy to go into details on that if you have questions. But anyway, the things that generally mostly impact affordable housing projects are, is it in a floodway, floodplain? What does the noise, and railroads end up being one of the things that you have to figure out. How much noise, how often does the railroad car pass, and how fast is it going? How much traffic is on the road next to the building there, the site that you're trying to develop? And then you have to do a noise calculation. And having a high noise, depending on how high it is, can either prevent you from building somewhere, or you have to do mitigation. So you got to know these things. You could have contaminated site, which is not in itself a deal killer, because there's a lot of ways you can finance brownfield financing that can actually help your deal. So that's not the worst thing that could actually happen, is to have some kind of contamination. But if you're buying an existing building, it is you can buy a building that has asbestos containing materials and lead-based paint, but you should be very wary of it, because it's something that you have to constantly monitor and make sure that there's no negative impact on your residents. Particularly if you have a family site and there's lead-based paint, you have to really make sure that you are containing that lead-based paint, or you have to remove it completely, which can be very expensive, because it's a really negative impact on children that are developing if they get lead-based paint exposure. So those are some of the environmental stuff. They're not all deal killers, but you have to do an analysis to find out. The other things you end up doing then is thinking about, well, now that I know what I can build here, what is it I want to do? What are the types of tenant characteristics? What are my income targets? Am I targeting, is it a family site? Is it seniors? Is it individuals? Is it permanent supportive housing? Is it targeting homeless households? What is it you're trying to, what type of product are you putting out there in the marketplace? Who do you want to live there? And then you have to look at all kinds of things that go into the site. Right now, the single biggest factor is construction costs. As people are probably aware, due to supply chain issues and COVID, not just the materials are getting more expensive and they're taking longer to deliver, but also the human labor. There's a human labor shortage. So just as an example, when tax credit, there's a 2 times a year that MSHA publishes its what's called a qualified allocation plan for people to apply competitively for tax credits. And typically there's about 50 or 60 applicants every year. So twice a year, so 100 to 120 applicants. A lot of times it's the same people. If they didn't get awarded the first round, they'll apply the second round. This last round, there was, I can't remember exactly, but I want to say there was like 12 or 15 applicants, which is just unheard of. But it's because people couldn't make their finances work, because the construction costs have gone up so high. They just literally couldn't figure out how to make it financially feasible. So those are all things you have to figure out as you're looking at your sites. And then on the right, I just show some sources that you can layer together and leverage to get to a point where that, grant-like funding that you might need to make your project feasible. These are like some of the ways that you can finance it. There's lots and lots of other ways too.
Jennifer.
Yep.
On that last slide, I think you might talk about it here, but you said on the bottom, like the low-income housing tax credit is by far the largest source of funding for affordable housing projects. And I'm just curious about like the percentage of dollars for low-income housing tax credits versus all of your other funding.
Oh, that's the next chart.
Oh.
There you go. So I did a, let's see, 9, 8, 9, whatever number of years that is, look back. And this includes all of our public housing redevelopment that we did, and then also include some separate like renovations that were in addition to like the full development. So of the $73 million, and this includes Lurie Terrace as well. So of the $73 million that we raised in the last whatever number of years, 10-ish, 9 years, more than half came from tax credits. Well more than half. And in fact, Lurie Terrace doesn't have any tax credits. So if you took Lurie Terrace out of this, it is about 60-70% of all of our developments. And we had other projects that we didn't have any tax credits as well. The second biggest for us, as you can see, are loans. And I mean, loans are scary for affordable housing development projects because there are things we cannot control. So rents are, we can't go to market rate. We can't do $800 this year and then, say, well, our finances aren't working, so we're going to bump that up to $1,200 next year, like a market rate developer could if the market could bear it. So we have, restrictions on how much we can increase our rents. Utilities, we have no control over, huge cost. We include utilities in the rent because we find, or we target, most of our households are extremely low income. Often, not the majority, but often we've had people who cannot get a utility bill in their name because they may have past utility bills they haven't been able to pay, or they do get a utility bill in their name and then they have a family crisis, a financial situation where they can't pay their utilities and their utilities get turned off. And so we just decided we'll just pay all the utilities. It's included in the rent. And that way it isn't a barrier for someone to live in our housing. But we cannot control what's happening in the marketplace on the utility side either. And we can't just, add $200 to our rent because utilities went up by $200 either. We have some wiggle room. It's all a formula. You can see the cities provided funding, but what you don't see is HUD at the top of the list. You do not see HUD at the top of the list, and it's surprising it's as high up there as it is because we literally applied for one grant from HUD for all this development, and it was about $350,000, and all the rest came from our public housing monies that we converted towards development. And so the reason HUD is even 1.9 million is happenstance. And we had a building burned down at Green Baxter, and those were the proceeds from that building. And that's why there's insurance proceeds in there. Does anybody have any questions about this site or this page?
Jennifer, I thought development was glamorous. This is really spoiling it for me.
Wait till you have to deal with environmental contamination in your building, then it's delicious. So
Jennifer, so just to clarify, the HUD money, most of that was when you had to switch over from public housing to the RAD conversions. Is that what most of that money is? And that will never come back to us again because that's done now?
That's
Okay.
correct. And we didn't have to, but we surely wanted to switch over from public housing under the RAD conversion. And it was under public housing, you get a operating subsidy, which is kind of like a rental subsidy, but it's not as generous. And then you get capital funds. So we took all of our capital funds and we just reinvested them in our project. Yeah, so they're all gone. We don't get those anymore. Any other questions? And the other thing about particularly affordable housing projects is each of these sources of funding has their own regulations. None of them are like, hey, if you have tax credit financing, we'll just let you follow the tax credit rules. No, it doesn't work like that. Even when we braid a tax credit financing with two of the biggest programs, tax credit financing and HUD vouchers, even on income certifications, we literally have to do 2 income certifications for the same household, for the same unit, and they'll have different numbers because they calculate it differently. And then you have, any other ones you add on to it, they'll have their own regulations. And one of the questions we get asked is, well, how come you don't have city code enforcement? We do have city code enforcement. We aren't, in the past, we weren't in the city's rental inspection program, but we get inspected by probably 4 to 5 entities a year because MISTA does an inspection. We have to do unit inspections because of our HUD funding. Our investor does an inspection, Federal Home Loan Bank, and any lender does inspections. So we get inspected multiple times a year on both the conditions of our units as well as are the people actually income eligible. So then the next step is, okay, I think I know what I want to do. I think it's financially feasible. Then you got to look at all your different funding sources and how do they score you. So you guys saw this, I think, at the last one that I did. So this is one of our projects, Swift Lane. So then we're like, okay, how are we scoring? You know, are we competitive? And so every application is different. And, you know, some might emphasize your income targets, some might emphasize your services you provide, some might emphasize your green construction or whatever. They all have their own rules on it. So these are just this was in 2016, 15, 16, somewhere in there. So every year also, or every 2 years, MISTA changes its QAP. So this isn't the current scoring for today, but it's going to be something similar to this for the tax credit financing. So then when you do that, you also have to juggle. Many funders say you get more points if you've secured your other financial sources. Okay, well, who's going to put their money in first? And so that's why I always say for local government, you should put your money in first so that you're showing that there's leverage so that people can put that in their grant applications or their tax credit applications for, you know, outside funding sources. Some other considerations are what is your legal structure that you're going to have, and what's the market like? And for the projects we looked at, we were looking at, well, what will the city disposition process look like? Are we going to do a ground lease, or is it going to sell to the Housing Commission for $1, and like trying to figure that kind of stuff out. And if you're a market rate developer, you're looking at what the demand is in the marketplace. Not so much. You do have to do a market study when you do affordable housing, and it does specifically look at lower income households, and it's similar to a market rate market study, but it is targeting a different part of the marketplace. And so this was just a housing needs assessment we did for the downtown. I think it was 2020, so 2 years ago, and near the downtown, but not on the campus part of downtown. And so this is what they found just 2 years ago was, you know, 1,300 to 1,400 demand for units at less than 30% AMI, 700 to 800 at 31 to 60, and 370 to 490 at 61 to 100. So all of these different projects that we're trying to develop, I have no concerns or worry that we will not be able to fill these units. There's a huge demand. I'm just going to quickly go through this millage information because I don't actually think we've done this yet. And the purpose of this educational series was to make sure that the HHSAB and the public and anybody who might have an interest in how the millage funds are spent have an understanding of how the affordable housing development process and market is working, so that we are appropriately allocating our dollars to the projects that we want to. Just a reminder, it's a 1 mil. The first year was estimated at $6.5 million, and as taxes increase, as property values increase, it'll increase over time. It's a 20-year millage, and the target is 60% AMI or less, so zero income to 60% AMI. It wasn't in the millage ballot language, but in the charter, the millage is not allowed to be spent in the floodplain or the floodway. So you may not have seen that on the ballot, but it is in the charter. And up to 20% of the funding can be used for tenant services for properties that receive, funds for capital expenditures. And then the city council adopted some guidelines to sort of guide, what the city's what the city believes is important, what they want to prioritize. I won't read out all these, you can see them. But these are things that you want to bake into a request for a proposal from the development community to make sure that you are prioritizing what is important to the city council and the community when they adopted the millage. So of course, when we get to that point, we'll go over all this again. And then these are some of the other items. So it's very flexible on the types of things you can spend it on, but really a priority towards sustainability, leveraging outside sources. And the easiest thing for me to do in the world would be to take this millage money and only use millage money and just build, 500 units or whatever. But that is not a big enough lofty goal in my mind. The more we can use this millage fund for leveraging other resources, whether it's really stupidly, ridiculously complicated, dumb, like tax credit financing and HUD financing, fine. But we will build more housing by leveraging the millage with other resources, and we'll get thousands of units instead of hundreds of units. And then, of course, making sure it's permanently affordable so that we aren't investing in something that goes market rate in 15 years or 20 years or whatever. So the strategy, and these are things that I've discussed with city council many times, is really to each year have a budget showing what the projects are in the pipeline, including the city-owned properties, but wanting to have some flexibility so that if something comes on the marketplace, it's like, wow, we really need to acquire that. I mean, it just can't pass it up. We need to figure out how to make that happen. And then develop some kind of application process for non-housing commission projects that embed all of these development priorities and underwriting guidelines into it. And just something to note, when you do particularly a new construction, but also can be renovation, but particularly new construction, you're gonna need your commitments for capital funds, and you're gonna spend your capital funds first for obvious reasons. If there's nobody living there, you don't have to spend tenant service dollars. You may have a commitment towards spending it, but you actually aren't gonna spend it till you have tenants living there. And so we've been tracking, and we will track, the city will track over time, tenant service dollars versus capital dollars so that we stay within that 20% limit. Are there any questions or comments on any of this so far?
And Jess, I see you have a question. Do you mind putting it in the Q&A for us?
Can you see? I can't see.
Not yet. I'm
not in
imagining
there
she
yet.
might be typing it now.
I'm gonna keep going, then when you see it, you can stop me.
Oh, here we go.
Okay.
Oh, where can we find the charter for the Affordable Housing Millage proposal?
Oh, probably, I'm gonna guess, if you go to the city's website, to the city clerk's portion of the website is probably where the charter is. I don't know if Travis or Lynn know better than I. That'd be my guess.
I'll try to find it right now, and then Teresa could maybe respond with it in the Q&A.
Okay.
Perfect, thank you.
All right, now I'm gonna pull a couple sites. I'm gonna go over a couple sites that were that we've done this analysis, and I'm gonna show you like how we got to where we got to, and then that will be the end of my presentation, where it's kind of taking all of these things I just discussed and saying, okay, this is why we ended up where we ended up on this particular site. So the first site is 350 South Fifth. It's the one right up next to Blake Transit Center, previously a YMCA, and it's been a long time site that the city's tried to develop as affordable housing. So we've spent a lot of time really thinking about how to approach development on this site so to be successful, but making sure we are replacing, at least the 100 SRO units that were there previously, but also partnering with the AAA to expand the transit capacity in the downtown, which is, their central transit area. And also partnering with the DDA on what their street and I don't know all their technical terms, what they call, but all the planning and all the things they're doing in the downtown, coordinating with them on the walking, the biking, the transit, all the different ways you get around in the downtown. So this is a site that is under D1 zoning, which is the densest, so to speak, zoning that you can do in the downtown. So this can actually be a very much taller, more dense site than any of the other sites that I'm going to show you. We've recently got PUD and supplemental regs approved by City Council. And the way we looked at this site was, if we want to use low-income housing tax credits, which is the biggest source of funding, and I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but there's a cap, a per development cap. You can't just have, $100 million tax credit project. There is a cap. It tends to be around $12 to $14 million in tax credits, but depends on the project. So a lot of times when a developer is doing a large project that's not multi-story, but it might be 2 to 3 story garden style, apartments, townhomes, they'll do it in phases. And so they'll apply for tax credits for one phase, then they'll apply for a second, and then they'll apply for a third. But when you're going from the ground up, you can't really cut a building in half and then later on build a second phase on top of that. So we looked at it as a 2-phased site with a smaller building that's all affordable as a 9% tax credit deal. And then a second phase, we don't know exactly what it'll be, but it could end up being a mixed income market rate, could be another affordable tower as a second phase, 9%, it could be a 4%, it could be kind of a different ways that you could look at it. We looked at it not as a family site per se, so we're looking at a studio 1 and 2 bedrooms with a mixture of incomes. And the thing that really took the most consideration in our design discussions, many hundreds of hours talking about it, is what happens on the first floor, which in a downtown site is always the most important part of your project, is what happens on the first floor. Where is driveway entrances? How does a garbage truck get in there to pick up your garbage? Where's your front door? How big is the sidewalk? Where are people walking? Is there a bus lane right there? Where are you putting your bike parking? Do you have a car parking? So there's all these different things you have to consider. And being that we're partnering with the AAA, how do we get buses on the site? So all of those things were many discussions until we finally got, this is our current plan that got approved by City Council. You can see in red is the bus where the AAA would be able to park additional buses, sawtooth style, so that people can get on and off at the transit center. But we also had to have a completely separate and additional lane just dedicated to the housing on the site, or the 2 towers on the site, because it was not safe to have that conflict between the buses and what was happening with the rest of the building. And with people doing, Ubers and Eats and all these different kinds of ways of interacting with the economy, trying to think about moving trucks and all of those kinds of things, we ended up having to push the building much closer to William than we originally had planned in order to accommodate that really wide alley. So that's not a very typical design, but it's because we're trying to meet all these public purposes. You can see like there's all this bike parking, all these garbage cans, blah, 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 blah. Any questions about this so far? Okay, the other site that we are looking at or getting farther along in our development is on the corner of Catherine and 4th. Also it is a surface parking lot. You can see all these green stars. We're like, perfect. This is a great site for affordable housing. It's the right size. It's small enough in a downtown. It's D2 zoning. It's got the right number of unit that we could put there. That's a perfect size for a 9% tax credit deal, on and on and on. The blue triangle was really trying to figure out how we're going to impact parking in the downtown. We had many discussions in the community through our community engagement about the parking, more so probably than the affordable housing. And so like that's different, like every site's different. Nobody's been complaining about losing parking at the 350 South Fifth next to the Triple ATA, but a lot of people care about parking on this site. So that impacts your design as well. So what we committed to do is there's only so many units we can build here. And when you have double loaded hallways, like when people talk about, oh, we have empty office commercial space, why don't we turn it into affordable housing? Well, it depends on how large that space is, because there are code requirements on windows, closets, size of, there's so many things code wise that you can't meet in a giant office building, but you have like a double loaded side hallways where you have, like if you're in a hotel and you're walking down the hotel and you've got your room on the left, you got your room on the right. And that's essentially how you design most apartments, not all, but in a downtown setting. So they're only so much width. And so when you do that, you actually end up with we were able to end up with a L-shaped building, and we were able to preserve, we tried to preserve as much parking as we could. We ended up with, started out with 24, now we're down to 20 because of various city code requirements for trash and landscaping, et cetera. But this is just an example of, a totally different site, and you come up with a totally different product. We ended up with, really our goal is to have all efficiencies in one bedrooms. And we're targeting supportive housing. We're doing supportive housing on both sites. And we are also doing a partnership with Art Space to also have people who work in the arts. Oh, Travis, you have a question, question.
I do have a question, and it might be slightly off topic, but I think it might be interesting to dig into slightly on the Catherine site. We had spoken about this a long time ago, and I've had a couple of other people ask me, because this is adjacent to Braun Court, and there are a number of vacant commercial buildings there now where Outbar and Common Language and the Gym Toy Center used to be. I had asked you about the feasibility or possibility of trying to acquire those as well, and either integrating them into the design and having, coffee shops or things like that in that space for the residents. And you indicated, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, that financing, when you start getting into commercial, gets really, really difficult and makes it nearly impossible. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that, and if there are options for including some of those more commercial aspects into some of these buildings.
Yeah, and yes, I'm glad you remembered, because I was like, oh no, what did I say? That sounds right. It is, when you do a development, and we are not in any way, shape, or form the experts on mixed use development. And we've only done all affordable with community centers. But these are things I'm learning as we're going forward. So when you do a affordable housing project, I don't know, maybe there's some funding out there, but I haven't come across it yet that says you can use your affordable housing financing and funding to develop commercial space. There's probably ways to do it, but whatever you do with that money, it's taking away from your affordable housing. So typically what I'm understanding of how, so for Catherine's a perfect example, and you can see on this first floor space, we have, just ignore the words, but just the purple part. So we have in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see there's like community room and offices and service space and a front desk and a fitness center. Those are all servicing the tenants in the building. So those elevators go up to the residents. And this is all part of your affordable housing development. You include it in your development cost as part of your affordable housing project. Because we have residential above a first floor, I can't like not build the first floor, but I'm not going to build it out. I'm going to put walls in, I'm going to put a floor in. I don't know how much plumbing and electric we put in, but you don't build it out and you don't use your affordable housing money to build it out. You have to actually come up with a different source of funding. So that's what you do when it's on the same site. If it was not even on this site, like I would have to raise commercial type money, like from the normal ways anybody else would raise it. We definitely couldn't use the affordable housing millage, for example, or any of the traditional. We could probably use some block grant probably, which is a limited resource, depending on if we can make it eligible use. So it is much harder to do mixed use financing, particularly with affordable housing, I guess is what I would say. And the other thing about that, you didn't ask, but I get asked all the time, what about the parking part of it? So you can include parking as part of your affordable housing development projects. Like we've got parking on all of our projects somewhere, somehow. But our actual intent, excuse me, on this site is to only have a couple spaces dedicated to the residents and that we would purchase, electric shared vehicles that they could use so that people who most of them wouldn't have a car anyway, but if they needed a car, we could have shared car use, and the rest we want to keep as public parking. And so for the public parking, that also, if it's public parking and not dedicated to our residents, that also cannot be funded with affordable housing, but we have the DDA who we're partnering with, and they can pay for that part of it. Any other questions about any of that? When you get to the next two sessions where you have much more sophisticated developers, you should ask them, how do they do mixed use financing? Sorry. Okay. My least favorite site, 415 West Washington. So this is extremely challenging for affordable housing for many, many reasons. And the brownfield is not the problem. Although having contamination, and having to do the cleanup does affect, like you couldn't do this as a adaptive reuse, which some people have proposed in the community due to the contamination that we've found in the building. Having to deal with that, as well as it being literally in the floodplain on that ground floor. So you wouldn't want to have residential housing, like, right on that ground floor. But it also makes it challenging for the usual sources of funding, like low-income housing tax credits and HUD financing. HUD is absolutely not eligible. You probably could use tax credit financing, but MSHDA has extra rules that the IRS doesn't have that ends up making it not very feasible there. And our own affordable housing millage doesn't allow in the floodplain. And there's all kinds of public purposes that we're trying to address, which each one of them makes it a little bit more expensive. And so it's hard on to do affordable housing. So for example, we have this chimney habitat that we're trying to preserve. So our design of our building was trying to preserve that adds extra cost. The tree line trail adds extra cost. We have to elevate the building, the residential portion above parking. You can do parking in the flood fringe, but not in the floodway. And so this entire building footprint is only in the flood fringe, not in the floodway. So that's a reduced footprint. And so really the most financially feasible, and you've got your demo that you have to deal with, your contamination, et cetera. So the most financially feasible project is really with a private developer doing market rate housing, likely with brownfield TIF to deal with all that infrastructure and contamination. And then that will trigger a requirement for, I think, was it, Teresa, 15% affordable units at 60% AMI. So that's the best way we could get both the building demo, the contamination dealt with, bringing it back on the tax roll, and having some affordable housing. So just a very, very different site from the other sites.
Jennifer, we have a question, if this is an okay time to throw it at you.
Go ahead. Yep.
How does the city prioritize having affordability with the other goals such as environmental sustainability when awarding these sites? The two seem to conflict due to higher costs.
If it were not for the affordable housing millage, I don't know if we would be able to meet the city's sustainability goals in the affordable housing projects that we're developing, because there is several things. So there's again, with the tax credits, I hate to beat that bush because I hate tax credits, but we have to use them. But there's a total development cost and a total per unit cost that you have to think about as you're doing your development. And if you exceed that, you get negative points. So if you're doing a lot of really cool, but more expensive, greener features, then you lose points and you're less competitive and you may not get your tax credit financing or whatever other funding sources you have. And we still may be in that situation, except for we may be able to make it work because we have our affordable housing millage to cover more gap than we otherwise would be. We'll probably still lose points on our total development costs, but we will let you know, because I have committed to meeting those goals and to letting city council know what that's going to cost to meet those goals. So that will all be public information once we get there for each of our projects. Some things are more expensive than others to implement. Just for an example, if you do all electric without having any gas HVAC, you save on, all the equipment and the materials that would be there to put an HVAC system in. So that's a saving, but electricity is more expensive right now than gas. So that could be a higher expense on the utilities, but it may not always be the higher, like these things it's a market driven thing. Or you may put materials or design in place that makes your energy use much less. And so you save on your utilities. So there's some things that are, more expensive to do than others. I was going to tell you my pet peeves, but we can say that for another day. Okay. I got 2 more sites. I'll be really quick. 1510 East Stadium is currently a beautiful, it looks beautiful from the outside, fire station number 2. It's so completely contaminated and in such horrible condition. It definitely isn't a candidate for active reuse, but we could do 3 or 4 story building with 20 some units there, or we could do some townhomes or some duplexes. It is has some good and some bad. It's a small site. It doesn't score very high on a tax credit project, and it's hard to do a tax credit project that's small like that. I know Avalon's done it. It's just hard because you have additional regulatory compliance and expenses, no matter how big your project is. So when it's a small project, it adds a lot of weight and a lot of cost to a smaller project that you can spread across a bigger project. But we're going to try to figure out how we can braid together funding to make this project work. I have no idea what that's going to look like yet, but we plan on doing something of a modest sized here. And then the last project is literally a strip of land off of Platte Road between Platte and Springbrook in a completely residential area, mostly 1 story, but some 2-story homes. And it seems like, wouldn't that be a more appropriate place, very different from our downtown sites, to try to do something that's like modest single family homes or duplexes, or maybe even like a habitat style housing. So this is not the highest on the priority right now. So we haven't really gotten any farther than what you see on the screen. But again, your design, your development is site specific. Is it financially feasible? Who are you trying to serve? That kind of stuff. You got to look at all those things in every site. I think this is my last. Yep, that was my last screen. Does anybody have any thoughts, questions about any of that?
Jennifer, for the last one that you just showed us with the potential single family duplex, whatever, are the per unit costs lower than a downtown site, or are they pretty much the same?
It's gonna depend. So everything's site specific. There is no water and sewer or sidewalks or roads on that site. So you have to build all of that infrastructure. Whereas like the downtown sites, you're literally next to a road. You just tap right into the sewer and water that's there. You don't have to run, all this new infrastructure. And because we're not in the downtown, we don't have our DDA partners to help us pay for that. But on the other hand, you're building small stick frame construction, which is generally cheaper than doing concrete, steel, or other types of construction. So we'll see where we end up. I'm not really sure. Generally speaking, doing single family homes and each one has their own furnace, their own roof, their own walls is more expensive than townhomes, where you're denser, closer together. You still may have to run infrastructure, but you don't have every single wall, exterior that you have to maintain as well. And that's the other part of it. We didn't really talk about it, but I think we talked about it in one of our previous sessions. One of the hardest parts to figure out when you're doing affordable housing development, and again, it does not matter if it's rental, if it's a co-op, if it's a land trust, if it's a home ownership, somebody somehow has to pay for ongoing maintenance. And if you don't have that built into your revenue structure, or if you're a homeowner and you're a low income homeowner and you don't have the ability to pay for when your furnace goes out, these are reasons why housing deteriorates in different neighborhoods, isn't maintained, becomes blighted. And that's a really important part of any kind of development process, is to make sure you have appropriate revenue coming in to maintain your properties, whatever they are. All right, thank you, everybody. See you next month. I might not be speaking next month. We'll see.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer.
Thank you.
All right, so that ends the session, and we'll move on with the rest of our